everybody. It is time for a new book review. So I recently read a biography of Calvin Coolidge, called Coolidge, and it's by Amity Shlaes. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Shlaes. But anyway, being from Vermont, I knew very little about one of the two presidents that were born here in this state. The other one is Chester Arthur. I, again, know not much about him. The only thing, there were some similarities between the two in that they both took over. They were both vice president and took over after the president died, and then were subsequently re-elected after that for a full term. Arthur was vice president to Garfield, who was assassinated, and then Coolidge was vice president to Harding, who died of illness or a heart attack, or I can't exactly remember. But yeah, so they both came from Vermont. I didn't do too much research on Chester Arthur before this. But it seemed like, basically he was born in Vermont, but then was in Massachusetts, basically. Or not Massachusetts, was in New York, basically, most of his life. And you could say the same for Coolidge. He was born in Vermont. He grew up in Vermont, but then moved to Massachusetts for college. Went to Amherst, and then basically stayed in Massachusetts and was very involved in public life in Massachusetts, in political life in Massachusetts for a long time, and then became the vice president and then the president. And he was a president who presided over the Roaring 20s. And he was very much a small government. Basically all he wanted to do was reduce the budget. Like, that was his his whole presidency was just like, cut the budget. It seemed like, obviously there were other things going on as well, but that was like his main focus, was just reduce the size of government, cut the budget, reduce taxes. And at the time the country flourished. Was it all because of that? Maybe not, but also, I think it had a lot to do with it. And so, yeah, this is a very interesting book. I knew really nothing about him going into it. And, it was really, like, some of the stuff was interesting, like the term, the silent majority, comes from this time. It comes from his supporters. So it wasn't him that coined the term, but someone in his circle coined the term the silent majority for his supporters. And I think it kind of played off of his nickname, which was Silent Cow, because he was a man of very few words. That was really highlighted throughout the book, just how little he spoke and how people kind of had to get used to being quiet with him, because he was just, he took everything in, but didn't say a lot about stuff. So that was interesting. Very, definitely an interesting character, definitely an interesting person, and had ties to Vermont throughout his entire life, even though he did move to Massachusetts. And, one of the other interesting things about his life is and this kind of highlights, just how far we've come in terms of, medicine, is that his son, one of his two sons, his younger son, actually, he died because he was playing tennis and got a blister on his foot and got sepsis and died because of it, like within a week or two, week and a half. And, it just kind of goes to show like how, at the time, in the 1920s, the president who, you know, had access to the most up-to-date, the most you know, latest research and latest medical, you know, and the best medicine in the country, the best medicine in the world at the time, and they couldn't save his son from an infected blister. So that really was incredibly sad, and really affected him. And, you know, it happened in the middle of his presidency, and he couldn't really, him and his wife Grace, they couldn't fully mourn his loss because they were dealing with running the country at the same time. So definitely an interesting book. Clearly Amity Shlaes like has a great reverence for him. I mean, the research she put into this book is, I mean, clearly she respects him a great deal, and what he did for this country. And it's interesting to, like, you know, he didn't run for a second term. I mean, he, you know, came in when Harding died and then ran for his first full term, and then declined to run for another. And Herbert Hoover was elected after him, who was very much a big spender. And then obviously FDR came in after that with the New Deal. That, you know, when I was growing up, I was taught that the New Deal brought us out of the Depression after the stock market crash, you know, in, was it 28? But the more you read about that, the more it actually may have prolonged, you know, the wild spending of Hoover and FDR may have actually prolonged the Depression longer than it would have if they hadn't intervened so much. And, you know, she kind of goes into how Coolidge, like, was watching Hoover just spend, and just didn't think that the government should be so involved in commerce and the economy. And so that was interesting. And the other thing that I thought was interesting was just like the politics of the time was like really kind of similar to now, 100 years later, in that the progressives were very prominent, but the progressives seem to be more on the Republican side than on the Democrat side, where that's kind of been, you know, upended. And like everyone was kind of like clamoring to show how progressive they were. And so that was interesting. And so yeah, it's definitely an interesting read. I will say I'm not a huge fan of her actual writing style. I felt it to be a little clunky, and it was an interesting read, but I wouldn't call it a fun read, if that makes sense. Because I found myself having to like kind of go back and reread sentences because I didn't read it with the right inflection the first time through. Because like it's hard to explain. I didn't find her reading very user friendly, I guess. Or her writing very user friendly. It wasn't a fun read or an easy read, and I felt like she kind of put like extraneous information in that didn't need to be there. And I wish she'd talked more about the actual economy of the 1920s, because she didn't really go into it. I mean, she said like, yeah, things were good, but you know, but it wasn't like she really described the economy before, and then she really described like the economy kind of afterwards. But she didn't really go into like what it was like, what like the economy was through his term, and how, I mean, we know it as the Roaring 20s. So, and she did talk about like the, you know, the Dow Jones was like, you know, climbing and stuff, but but I wish she talked more about like how that affected like the people of the time. So, but anyway, but then at the same time, like she put like she would just put like some random person's name in, like, okay, who is this person? And they never showed up again throughout the rest of the book. It was just like, oh, so and so made a comment about such and such, and it's like, well, okay, didn't need to know that, but fine. So it was just kind of so there was like funny stuff like that, but overall I felt that it was interesting, and it was interesting to learn a lot of the history of in depth, a chunk of history of the country, and also some of the history of my state that I didn't know as much about. And so yeah, so that, I mean, if you are interested in Vermont history, I would definitely recommend this, because it's part of our history as the state. But I think if you're looking for more like, if you're just interested in Coolidge for some reason, but if you're looking for more of like of history, like about that specific time, there might be other books that are more fun to read. So anyway, I don't regret reading it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed learning about him and his family and his ties to Vermont, and what he did through his presidency and the people that surrounded him. And also, I mean, I grew up, he went to Amherst, and they talked about that area as well, which I frequented because I grew up in southern New Hampshire, and so we would go down to that area of Massachusetts all the time, and I went to school in that area of Massachusetts as well. So it was high school. So that was fun, just like learning about the region and how it was at the time. So anyway, check it out. This ended up being kind of a long book review, but that's Coolidge by Amity, Shlaes, and I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, hit the like button, share, subscribe, and I will see you all tomorrow with a Farm Friday, and I can talk about what I wanted to talk about last week. So have a great rest of your day. Bye.